So my name is Bill Humphries. I'm a web developer at White Hat. I guess we're a sponsor of the conference, so I want to thank you guys for taking time from your schedule to come out this afternoon. I am a University of Texas alumni, and this is actually the first time I've been back on the campus in about 13 years. And the main thing I forgot living in California for so long is how humid and warm it is out here. So the code that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon can be found on GitHub under my account whump. And here's what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I'm going to talk about making a single-page web app. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by single-page web app. How many of y'all, just hands up, have heard of single-page web apps? How many of you are making single-page web apps right now? How many are using Perl backends for your single-page web apps? Awesome. Okay. We're going to talk about a library that is being used in a lot of projects on the web right now that's called backbone.js. It provides models, views, and controllers for building these applications. And then in our particular example, we're going to use the Modulicious Lite library. How many of y'all have been using Modulicious in smaller number. Modulicious is awesome. Joe McMahon, one of my colleagues at White Hat, told me about this when I was thinking about doing this talk, and he said you should do it in Modulicious. So, going back to what's a single-page app? A single-page web app does the following. We download a single HTML document. So in the example application that we're building, that's it. You can see over here that that's the whole body. Everything else are the scripts we're loading. And even here, I'm cheating. In a production application, I would use a loader library like require.js to go through and manage my requirements and only load things when I need them. For the purposes here of just creating something on the fly, I'm loading all my libraries from Cloudflare. So jQuery, because everything requires jQuery. Mustache, which is a templating library. Underscore, which is used by Backbone, and then finally, my actual application script. So we use the JavaScript that was described in that previous slide over here is going to be managing our views. When I want to get data, I make an XML HTTP request out to the server. I don't load a new page. And then finally, I use a controller, which I'm getting from backbone.js, to allow me to switch between views. So you can think of it as basically, I change the route, or in this case the URL, it changes the associated view, which then in turn updates the underlying model. So let's look really quick at that application. So the simple application here is just a list of talks. If I click on a talk, I get to the next talk. I can click to go back to the list of talks. I can go to the previous next within the talks. And I'm sorry, I'm being judgmental in the API about judging people's talks, so I hope I didn't accidentally collide with the names of someone who was actually speaking here. This is a hypothetical conference. Notice what I'm doing to get between these. All I'm doing is hitting a link. I'm not hitting something that says JavaScript do this. All I'm doing is I'm hitting a link. The controller is observing what's up here and then triggers the new view. So that's a key characteristic of these types of applications. So let's get back to the slides. So why are we doing this? For a couple of reasons. One is that backend devs can focus on building fast APIs. And of course, by putting a picture of server farms, that's what I mean by fast APIs. And then the front-end developers are already using JavaScript. And this is an opportunity to go to your front-end developers and say, hey, here's all these great new tools that you've been hearing about in JavaScript from events like Fluent Conference and HTML5 DevConf. Here's an opportunity to start using these tools. And I was actually just talking to some folks from cPanel a few minutes ago up in the lobby of the LBJ school. They're actually doing this for a particular reason is cPanel runs on a lot of virtual host and a lot of memory-constrained virtual host. So for them, the ability to offload more work onto the client that is a modern web browser and have cPanel, the application, doing the heavy lifting of managing a customer's websites and offloading all the UI work to the client is a very powerful tool for them. There are reasons why you don't want to do this. The first one is your content is static. Don't follow this pattern to build a weblog. Don't follow this pattern to build a news website. This code is some code that I did from a view source on NPR.com. This is a news story on NPR.com. It is pushed up to S3. There is some JavaScript that fires. There's this page-specific JavaScript that hooks up and does things such as wiring to social media. It wires up Discuss for comments, but the content doesn't change, unless there's an editor goes through and revises a story. You don't update, you don't dynamically interact with your blog except through comments. So you can just go ahead and use a third-party commenting system. So if you're in the Python world, there's tools like Jekyll. In the Perl world, of course, there's tools like PyBlossom. I don't know if Rail Dornfest is still updating that. And of course, movable type, which is another tool that you could use for managing static content sites. Your content needs to be indexed by search engines. There's a couple of ways of dealing with this. First of all is that that Googlebot doesn't yet understand JavaScript. So if we go back over to that page that I was showing you, that's all that Google's going to see of your website. It's not going to index anything. And if it's not indexing anything, then it's not going to show up when I say, hey, I want a cheap Nokia smartphone. And they're not going to come to your website that's selling the cheap Nokia smartphones. Speaking of smartphones, you also may be in a situation where you need to run on a device that is not an iPhone and is not an Android. The phone pictured here is a new Nokia phone that they released. It's the Aria 501, I think is the model name. It is being marketed to South Asia and China. And that phone does not have a full browser stack in it, does not have a full JavaScript engine in it. What it has is a proxy server that Nokia runs, and so if you are relying on JavaScript to execute on the client, it is not going to be rendered on that device. So those are three things you can keep in mind. Now, I'm going to ask you to look at some work that Pamela Fox has been doing in some presentations she's been doing. She's basically gone through and taken Coursera and made them into a single page application. There is a trick you can use using a tool like Phantomjs. How many of y'all have heard of Phantom? It's a really great tool for testing. One of the things you can also do is simply put Phantom in line, and if you get a request and it identifies itself as a Google bot or a Bing bot or a whatever bot, then have Phantomjs go through, fetch the page, and hand the rendered HTML to the device. The only thing is you've added another point of failure in your system, and if you're really dependent on SEO, that may not be the right thing to do. But go through and please read Pamela Fox's blog and look at some of her stuff that she has up on SlideShare, and she's been dealing with this problem over at Coursera a lot because, of course, they're very dependent on SEO. So back to the problem. So the core of all these things, of these single page apps, is routing. And sorry, just double checking my time. In that single page app that I demonstrated, you wanted to do two things. You wanted to see the entire list, and you wanted to see a detail. So we can convert that say, okay, host name gets us the whole view, and then host name hash item ID gets you a detail view. API is a similar thing. So we want an API that we call out to and returns JSON that we're going to turn into views. So we want an API route that returns an entire list, and an API route that returns a single item. So here's the API routes, hostname / API / item, and hostname API item / ID. So you get this really great parallelism going on. This is sort of the Rosetta Stone of designing these applications. You have on the server side, we have the APIs, and then we have the corresponding paths for views on the client. And you can visualize them saying, here's the JSON, here's the rendered HTML. So this is what it looks like really without going to great detail on the Perl side in Modulicious. In Modulicious, of course, you define applications by basically defining handlers. So you say get / returns an index. Index here is just a convenience thing. It's just the thing that returns the stub page. Then API item, we just have something, we write a handler that will return that list of JSON with all the events. And then API item ID will return us a particular item detail. And here's what that same sort of code looks like on the browser side in Backbone. I'm not going to get it, again, because of the amount of time that we have for the talk and the difficulty of showing live code. I'm going to really recommend that you just go ahead and clone the repository and run it on your system. It's very easy to install and run Modulicious. So handlers. So the handlers that we're going to talk about now are on the client side. So here again, those are the routers that we had defined in Backbone. So I need to define a main and a detail. So main's going to generate that list of events, and then detail will render an event in detail. So here is my attempt to show you some code. So you can basically say, here is the main view. So what main's going to do is just simply say, have we created this view yet? And that view is going to list here inside this object called app views main. If it doesn't, then we're just going to create it. If it already does, so essentially we're going back from a detail to the main view, then we're just going to tell, hey main, render yourself. And we'll talk about what these views are in a moment. Detail is the same basic thing. Obviously, there's an easy refinement that I could do to this and reduce the amount of code here to handle both cases. Views. So the main view that we referred to up from earlier is another object that we get from Backbone, and we just basically create new views by extending off the base view object. They have a render method over here. So the render method for the main view is basically take all of those subview, all of those detail objects and generate some markup. So this is that mustache library that I mentioned earlier that you load. We just create a little inline template. We're going to take the model object, pass it into it, and then append it to the base element of that view object. Same thing with detail. We get a little bit fancier with detail in that if we can't find a route, or excuse me, if we can't find a model for the route that we're given, just render essentially a 404 message. So again, changing a route, changes the associated view, updates the underlying model, updates, and if it's necessary, updates the rendering of that underlying view. So in the limited amount of time that we have, just want you to remember 3 things from this before you go off and start playing with the code and start extending off of it. Is first, when you're designing these single page applications, what you want to do is design much as possible the API and client routes in parallel. There are going to be there's a set of cases where you don't want to do that. Look at a presentation from HTML5 DevConf by one of the developers over at SoundCloud. The problem that you can run into is if you have a public API that has lots of sub-resources and you have to make lots of sub-resource requests in order to have enough data to build one view, you may want to invest in having essentially the API equivalent of a materialized view. And again, the pattern when in these applications, change a route, changes the view, changes the model. And there's actually another arrow that's missing from here that goes back up from, if the model changes, then the view that's listening to the model will update itself. And again, most of these transitions are all going to be clicking a link rather than necessarily clicking a button or doing some other action. It is going to basically be like following links in a web application, except what we're doing is updating the page instead of going to a new page. So, some things to do. There's not enough time to talk about require, but require is a way for managing your libraries and components so you're not loading 15 different JavaScripts at the bottom of your page. There are a bunch of upcoming talks through the rest of the conference that I recommend. JT Smith, who I believe is giving a talk Tuesday morning about API design for web services. My colleague Casey West is giving another talk on front-end UI tools and libraries, and that's on Wednesday. That's on Wednesday. Carl Masick is giving a general talk on the state of JavaScript on Wednesday, and then Brock Wilcox is talking about another library for doing model view controller that follows a different design philosophy than Backbone.js. It's called AngularJS. It's been developed over at Google, and he's giving a talk on that on Wednesday afternoon. So we have 3 minutes left for questions. Yes? So Angular is using a mode that's more declarative. So what I'm doing in Backbone is essentially I'm saying, here's an element on the page, and like an identified ID. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to tell a view to render inside of that element. Whereas in Angular or in a library also, Knockout is another library that uses a declarative pattern where you say, in your markup, you say, this markup observes this model. And then when the code runs, then essentially it's listening for changes to your model data, and it's doing the binding there. So you can think it is essentially in Backbone, I'm doing my bindings in the script, and in Angular and Knockout, I'm doing my bindings in the HTML. So there's a design philosophy difference. There are benefits and drawbacks to both of them. Yes?
What are the gains over using like the Perl backend besides the view rendering?
So the part of the gains again is separation of concerns. Your Perl devs don't have to be HTML devs. You can basically have your HTML and JavaScript people focusing on building those views, and your Perl people focus on building and providing data to those views. And again, there was the example I mentioned with cPanel. cPanel was actually, and I apologize, I'm running back and forth on the mic. The cPanel is actually running a problem with their memory constraint. If you try to generate the view inside of a 512K virtual machine or a 512 megabyte virtual machine, you may run out of memory. So move that to a device that has memory. Anything else? Yes?
Is any of this applicable to creating a single-page web app that doesn't run on a server, something that's stored in a local file
So there you're going to run into issues with the security models that exist in browsers. So one way you can do that is to use local storage, which is an HTML5 API, which means it's not going to run on IE6, it's not going to run on IE7, it might run on IE8. But you could use that to store data. HTML5 also introduces some new caching schemes that you can use. So there it really is a case of if you just want to download a file that contains all the bits that you need and run it locally, then you could try doing that. But again, you're going to run into the browser security model because part of that is the browser security model is trying to prevent you from hitting the file system.
Can I otherwise provide all the data in a similar way that you described?
You could. One way you could certainly do is just bootstrap the data in the page. Now, we've been experimenting with bootstrapping data in pages and actually found that it was slowing us down, that it was actually faster for us to go off and say, hey, server, give me this view, instead of saying, wait for the APIs to return and then render everything. Write that has a big blob of JSON on the page, and then go through and parse it and display it. Awesome. Thanks very much. Oh, wait a minute, one more.
Can you show your repository again?
Sure, hold on. It's probably easier for me to do this. Yeah, just look for whump on GitHub. Awesome. So thanks very much. I'm going to be around the rest of the afternoon. Unfortunately, I have to return to San Jose because of family business tonight. But enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon.